Hi, and welcome to this first interview for the Salon. The Salon is a new initiative of the Enlightened Enterprise Academy. The name the Salon refers to the idea of the Paris Salons that were an instrumental, important institution in the development of the first Enlightenment. We're hoping that our Salon will be a catalyst for the development of a new Enlightenment. And you can read more on the website what we mean by the idea of a new Enlightenment. Today, I'm very pleased to say that I'm interviewing John Alderdice, or Lord Alderdice. John is a member of the UK House of Lords. John's also a former president of Liberal International, which is a world federation of liberal political parties. He was a key negotiator in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, which brought about an end to the troubles in between Northern and Southern Ireland. And soon after the Good Friday Agreement was agreed, he became the first Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly. He's trained as a psychoanalytic psychiatrist, and he's an executive chairman of the Changing Character of War Centre at Pembroke College in Oxford. John's special areas of interest include religious fundamentalism, political violence, and the problems of indigenous peoples. So I think this is going to be a very important and interesting first interview for the Salon. The purpose of the Salon is to discuss the issues associated with what we mean by a more enlightened approach, not just to the way we manage businesses and institutions and so on, because enterprise happens in every sector. So welcome, John, and let me remind viewers of the kind of backstory to how we came to meet each other and the backstory to this interview today. Very briefly, John wrote an article called Beyond Reason, which was published towards the end of 2023, if I remember correctly. And then that prompted me to write a post with some thoughts and comments. It resulted in a conversation between the two of us, and then that's led to, well, the conversation that we're going to have today. So that's just a very quick backstory. There's an important point to make as well, because the first series of interviews for the Salon, I called it Inflection Point, and that referred to a comment that John made in the article, which is a belief that we are at an inflection point in human history. So I'll just read briefly the quote to give you some context, and then I'll dive straight in with the interviews to John, the questions for John, sorry. So John said, at this inflection point in human history, it remains an open question whether global leaders and their followers can put shallow, selfish, short-term political and economic interests aside in favor of global peace, stability, and reconciliation, or even the survival of our species. But the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. So that's a kind of almost a double-edged sword in terms of a quote, in kind of optimism and pessimism combined there. And at the beginning of the article, John, you said that you were, to begin with, really quite pessimistic, but then you reflected on certain points in history and realized that actually we've been at similar kinds of inflection points in the past. So I wonder if you could just begin the interview by explaining a little bit about that.
Yes, certainly, Paul, and thank you very much for the invitation to this conversation. I find myself from 2013, 2014 onwards getting quite down about the direction in which things were going. As you have indicated, I have a background in psychology as well as politics. And so I was observing what was happening, not just with a political eye, but also trying to understand what was happening psychologically, both with individual leaders, but perhaps more importantly with communities and the way things were going in their relationships. And I was getting very troubled because I thought we're heading towards a major global conflict. We've had two, World War I and World War II. And I called this the third global conflict rather than World War III, because World War III would make it sound as though we were going to have a rerun of the other two global conflicts. And I believe that, yes, there would be certain similarities, of course, but there would also be substantial differences. And who knows, perhaps very substantial differences in terms of the outcome as well. And I was getting quite down about that. And then we came to 2017. And I'd written a number of articles and made speeches about my thoughts. But I was prompted at that time to recall that 500 years before, in 1517, Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Catholic Church in Wittenberg, or at least that's the mythology anyway. He certainly made them public. And this triggered an enormous change in attitudes, not just from a religious point of view, but also politically and intellectually. Now, I say triggered because it didn't cause them, and indeed there were other triggers as well. But a number of things had obviously happened at that time that led indeed to not peace, stability, and reconciliation, but the wars of religion. But ultimately, it led to progress. And I began to reflect on that and to reflect on what had been happening 500 years before. And there were at least three important elements, it seemed to me, that created the context for this triggering of the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and so on. The first was that in the late 1400s, Gutenberg had invented the printing press. Now, you and I might not think of printing as a disruptive technology nowadays, but I can guarantee you that there were men, mostly men, sitting around their tables in places like Oxford and drinking good red wine and talking about the dangers of this terrible business of printing. And what was worse, not only were things being printed and made available to very large numbers of people, but they were being printed in their own language, in the vernacular, in German, in French, in English, and all sorts of people would be able to write and read things in their own language. And people would have been sitting there saying, this is going to destroy things, it's going to upend the social structure. And of course, they were absolutely right about that. It did. And it caused all sorts of difficulties. But we don't look back now and say, well, I wish we'd never invented printing. We look back and say that was a marvelous piece of progress. It was disruptive and difficult, but it led to all sorts of positive things as well. So that was one thing, disruptive technology. And I thought, well, we've got lots of disruptive technology nowadays, to the power of n, really. The second thing was that it seemed to me that at that time, people were very disenchanted with their leaderships. The main leaderships, of course, were the church and political leaders. And people felt these folk who are in charge, they don't care about us. They have no interest in us. And what's more, they're completely corrupt. They're dishonest. We can't trust them at all. They're dishonest financially, but in all sorts of other ways too. So there was no sense of respect. At least this is the direction in which things were developing in many parts of Europe and beyond for the political and religious leadership. And of course, over the last few years, that's what we've seen too in the whole of the Western world and beyond. We've seen people disenchanted and feeling a sense of corruption, dishonesty, lack of integrity, not just political leaders or religious leaders, but leaders of sport and culture and art and almost every aspect of life. People have become disenchanted. And the third thing was that at that time, things were happening in science. People like Copernicus and Galileo were discovering that the world was not the center of the universe. It wasn't flat. It wasn't any of the things that the religious leaders and previous intellectuals had maintained. It was quite a different scene. And of course, many people who were in intellectual leadership within the church and within society were troubled by these new ideas, and they weren't convinced about them, and they realized that they would upend the way that people thought about life and indeed the life beyond in the case of the church. And so they opposed all these new ideas of science, and they didn't really understand them. And as I looked around during COVID and so on, it became clear to me that the same kind of thing was happening now, that people were not respecting a proper scientific approach with all its uncertainties and doubts. People wanted certainty in this period of change and disruption. But of course, if we look back at what happened then, it did lead to the wars of religion, but it did lead to enormous progress in science and technology, in medicine, communications, travel, in all sorts of ways. But I just began to wonder, was it possible that at the end of this 500 years, this half millennium, this progress that we'd been working towards, this way of thinking that we call Enlightenment thinking, had sort of run its course? And not that it wasn't true, but it wasn't enough, that there were other ways of understanding things that were necessary. And there was a danger, of course, that we would end up with terrible trouble. And what we didn't have 500 years ago is we didn't have environmental crisis, and we didn't have the potential of a nuclear holocaust. But if we could find a way of not destroying ourselves through those two potential utter catastrophes, then perhaps we could do what they did then, which was to find a new way of thinking which would take us forward. And so I began to think in a more positive way about what new ways of thinking there might be that would take us beyond to what I know that you've sometimes called a second enlightenment, well, whatever term we use for it, certainly a new way of thinking about things that gives us hope and opportunity.
So you've just described the transition to the first enlightenment, really, and the disruptive effect of that, and the fact that it caused so much social change. And I understand from research that I've done that it actually was referred to as an age of angst. And it's interesting because that term, an age of angst, has been used recently to describe the current situation by the Turkish author Elif Shafak. And I think that kind of really does perfectly describe the situation at the moment for the reasons that you've described. And closely related to the issue of corruption is the sort of sense of unfairness because of growing levels of inequality again. So in that sense, we seem to have reversed, going backwards in some senses or another. I mean, if you look at it over a long-term horizon, of course, the first Enlightenment produced massive amounts of progress. So it depends on the time horizon you're looking at things always. But at the moment, people generally feel that things are not getting better right now in the last sort of decade or so. And with AI and the new technologies, wondering what it's going to mean in terms of job security and various other things. Yes, it would seem like we need a new. You described the first shift as a paradigm shift, and it would seem that we need a new paradigm. But it would seem at the moment that we're only at the very beginning, and the new paradigm is not yet clear. Is that fair to say?
I think that's absolutely right. And in the meantime, Elif is absolutely right. This is an age of angst, of anxiety. And of course, we all feel a sense of anxiety when we know that change is taking place or is about to take place, but we don't know what that change is going to take us to. Is it going to take us to a better place or a less good place for us? Is it going to take us to a place which may be better for some people, but not better for me, perhaps? Or is it going to be something that's completely disastrous for everybody? And we don't know that at all. There are others who have a view. John Gray, for example, the English philosopher, has a view that the period we've lived through over the last 100 years or so has been a kind of gap almost in history. It's been a very untypical thing with liberal democracy and so on. And actually, we're going to return to history, not in the sense of going backwards, but in the sense that this was a kind of a hiatus in the long-term development of history, though not necessarily a development that's looking positively and optimistically, as Marxists have done, as liberals have done, but rather that the struggles between the powerful and the less powerful will simply return kind of with a vengeance, I suppose. And people are troubled, they're frightened about this. I'm not so sure that it's all entirely about inequality, because there's always been inequality and there always will be inequality. We have different genes, we have different capacities. There's always going to be inequality. But I think what really troubles people is when they sense that that's an unfair inequality. There was some interesting work done looking at the period of inequality prior to the development of tertiary level education in parts of the Middle East. And before the development of tertiary level education for many young people, there was inequality, of course. But people looked at it and they said, well, we know it's unequal, but it's unequal because these people have better education than us, and therefore they're able to earn more money and do better and so on. So people didn't like it very much, but it seemed that it wasn't entirely unfair in that there was a rationale. Once people came to the end of tertiary level education and they still couldn't get the jobs and there still wasn't any prospect for them, then they got really, really angry, because it wasn't just a question of inequality, it was a question of unfairness. And that's something that affects us deeply. I remember whenever our two boys were much younger, and they now have children of their own, but in the time when they were children and they would maybe have an argument, one would come to me about the other, and he didn't say, we're unequal. Of course they were unequal. They were different ages, they were different sizes. But when they would come and say, it's not fair, Daddy, it's not fair. And you could see it was coming from in here. It wasn't some intellectual measuring up of what was equal. And so I think that that's the thing that really upsets people, this sense that things are unfair and things are frightening. And the question is, can we find a way of containing our anxiety and our anger sufficiently to find a way through to a better way of understanding things, a way of understanding things that has different characteristics. For example, instead of viewing things in a linear way, we begin to think of it not just in terms of systems, but in terms of complexity. And that's quite difficult to think your way through, but I think there's quite a lot of evidence that complexity science may well be the wavefront of thinking, not just in terms of science itself, in physics and economics and so on, but also in terms of how we manage society. And that's one of the things that gives me some sense of possibility and optimism.
Yeah, I think the challenge of getting our heads around the levels of complexity that exist these days is, adding to the sense of fear. But we'll probably come back to that during the conversation. I wanted to read just one other quote from the article, because in it you sort of suggest some of the things that we need to do to find a positive way forward. So I'm going to just quickly read that and ask you if you would comment on it. You say that if we focus on fairness, cooperation, community, and a radical new way of understanding based on complexity theories and the full breadth of human knowledge and science, you frame it as a question. You say, might it bring peace, stability, and prosperity? So you frame that as a question. I wonder if you got an answer to that question.
I think that it won't immediately bring all of those good things, because whatever change you make, there are likely to be some people that see it, and probably quite realistically see it, as beneficial to them, and others who will say, well, we're losing out on this. One obvious example at a geopolitical level is the so-called Thucydides trap, where you've got a hegemon like the United States, and you've got other powers coming up, like China, Russia, of course, but perhaps more China, India, indeed, other powers, and they're coming up. And so the single hegemon that there has been over the last couple of decades or so begins to realize it's losing power, and it doesn't like that very much. So it feels it's losing out in some way. Now, one might make the argument that, well, if we can move to a fairer world where there's more stability and more security for everybody, surely that will be better. Well, in a way, yes. But of course, it was also going to mean a pluralism of cultures, because not everybody is going to buy into the American culture. I mean, lots of Americans don't buy into it, but certainly lots of people in other cultures don't buy into it. And that may not necessarily be welcome. So there's this uncertainty. But if one can find a way of containing that anxiety and anger, that uncertainty, that sense that we might be losing out, even if overall there's a benefit, then what kinds of things might characterize that? Well, I've talked a little bit about fairness, and how fairness is actually, it seems to me, more important than equality, which equality can never be can never be obtained. It's just not possible. We are different. And in fact, we talk about equality, but we don't actually mean that we want equality. Whenever people talk about that, what they mean is somebody else has more than me, and I would like to have what they have. But what they don't say is, well, my children are quite bright, and I wish they were less bright so that they were like other children. People don't say those kinds of things at all. But what they do feel, I think, very strongly, is that they want things to be fair. Now, complexity science, in the very nature of things, is complex, and it takes a little bit of thinking through to understand how we might perceive it, how we might engage with complexity. What one way is to look at some elements. So, for example, one element of complexity is that when you reduce things down to their simplest level, which was an approach taken in Enlightenment science, you actually lose some important data, some structuring and ordering of things that could not be predicted. Now, for example, we know that water is made from hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. And you can understand everything there is to understand about hydrogen and everything there is to know about oxygen, but it won't tell you anything about water. And indeed, you could take a molecule of water, H2O, and you could have that. It wouldn't tell you about wetness and what wetness consisted of. Why? Because as you bring things together in a structured and ordered way, that introduces new properties which were not predictable on the basis of knowing the original properties. Another way of looking at it would be people. You get a group of people together, and each of them brings their own individual background and intellect and emotions and experiences and so on. But when you bring those people together, you can have certain hopes and expectations of how that group might work, but you don't know what will happen. It may fall to pieces. They may fight and argue, but they may actually discover new ideas, new things in art, in culture, in science, in mechanics, whatever. And you can't tell what will emerge from that. That's an important thing about complexity. You can't, and that makes people anxious. If you can't tell what will emerge, then people like the security of knowing what can emerge. But complexity tells us you can't do that. And that takes us, I suppose, to the other thing which I think is maybe really important in engaging with people outside of science. And that is that really what complexity is about relationships. Relationships at the level of fundamental physics, but relationships at every conceivable level, right through to relationships that are interplanetary and intra-universe and so on. But importantly for all of us, when you start talking about complexity, people's eyes kind of glaze over. Well, what is he talking about? But when you start talking about relationships, people say, oh, yes, I have a sense I know a bit about that. And in my own experience in dealing with the problems in Northern Ireland and in other areas of conflict, the key is not to say these guys are right and these guys are wrong. This side is good and this side is bad, but to say there's something of a disturbed historic relationship between these communities. And what we have to address is the community relationship, not the question of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, or who is right and who is wrong. And those are the kinds of ways of thinking that I think offer us the possibility of moving forward and surviving, maybe even thriving in a new dispensation.
So what you've just said, amounts to part of the critique of the first Enlightenment to some extent. The fact of looking at everything in a very sort of atomistic, microscopic level, so we really understand the detail, but then we don't understand the whole is greater than the sum of the parts and so on. We do start to understand that if we do focus on the relationship between different things within the system or people within society. And I wonder if the interesting thing is that our relationship, not just with each other, but also our relationship with nature, the planet, our environment, and so on, is increasingly proving to be problematic. And again, that relationship with nature was also a consequence of Enlightenment thinking, the idea that we can control everything. Do we need to kind of have a different attitude and stop wanting to be in control of everything and recognize the fact that it's more important to have a good relationship than be in control.
I think this is very important indeed, Paul. And I would say, just in reference to some Enlightenment thinkers, not all of them were as reductionistic as things became subsequently. Some of them understood that there was a complexity, there was a mystery about a lot of these things. They didn't quite know what to do about it. But they did understand. I mean, some of the writings of Isaac Newton, for example, show that he was exploring alchemy and all sorts of mystical kind of phenomena as well, because he realized that although his mathematics and his physics and his astronomy and so on did take things forward enormously, there was something he couldn't quite get the hold of. So I think it's important to recognize that they weren't as simplistic as sometimes the post-Enlightenment thinkers made them out to be. But yes, I think it is very important to go beyond where things were, and indeed to understand this relationship, for example, with nature. I'll give you an example. I'm very interested in the question of indigenous people, because as far as this is concerned, and there are many other reasons for it too, as far as this is concerned, I think that they have not forgotten some important things about the relationship with nature that the rest of us have forgotten. And so engaging with them can help us to understand something more about this question of the relationship with the environment. And I remember talking to an indigenous chief on the west coast of America, and he was very cross about environmentalists. And he said, these bloody environmentalists, he said, they're driving me crazy. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, well, he said, for example, they're stopping us hunting. He said, I had an argument with this environmentalist, and I said, why are you stopping us hunting? We've been doing it for hundreds, for thousands of years, and it didn't destroy things. He said, but I'm trying to protect the environment. And the indigenous chief said to him, I'm part of the environment and you're not protecting me. And I thought, that's a really important concept. Not that I'm the steward of the environment or I'm in charge of the environment, or even I'm protecting the environment, but I'm part of the environment. I'm in it. I'm not above it. And of course, that's really what you're saying. It's a different way of relating with the environment. And I think it's a very important difference in thinking. And if we can find our way to that way of thinking, what relationship do we have with the rest of the environment and the wider environment, even beyond the world, then I think it gives us a different perspective on things. It may seem in the first instance to be a subtle difference, but the further you explore it, the more you realize the enormity of the implications.
So I'd be very interested in your views on the importance of language in this context as well. So we talk about, for example, governance and management, and there's others that argue that really, and if we want to think about how we change our relationships, we should be using the thinking around stewardship and rather than governance and management. And because governance and management suggests a much more controlling kind of relationship, stewardship is often associated with the an analogy of cultivating the garden and looking after the long-term cultivation of the right kind of conditions in which the right kinds of relationships can flourish. I'm guessing that you probably have some views on that.
Well, I do, and I think it's not as straightforward even as one might imagine. I agree with you that moving from the notion of governance to stewardship is a step in the right direction, but it still is a sense of control. I am the steward, I am managing this, and I'm containing the problems, and I'm making decisions about what will grow and what will not, what's a weed and what is not, and so on. And of course, there's an element of that which is absolutely true. My father was a Presbyterian minister, and he grew up on a farm, and he was very close to nature. All his life, it was very, important to him, and he loved gardening and so on. And we used to go camping in the west of Ireland. And I remember we were out for a walk one day. I was relatively young, I don't know, 10 or 11 years old at the time. And we were walking along this little road with dry stone walls around us and fields, small fields on the other side. And as we were passing, he saw that there was a man working on a vegetable patch. and it was very fruitful. He had found ways of getting a lot of good vegetables growing. And my father looked over, and of course, in a typical kind of pastoral ministerial way, he said, "Well, you're doing a great job there. Isn't it marvelous what the Creator has given us?" And the man just looked at him and said, "You should have seen what it was like when he had it to himself." In other words, it's all very well to say, "Oh, well, let's just let nature be nature." But of course, if we let nature be nature, we let disease run rampant as well. Now, of course, if we over control things, we can create disease and we can create problems. So it's a very difficult kind of balance. It's a relationship. And that's why, although I see stewardship as a step in the right direction, and you're absolutely right when you say that language is really important in these things. We don't just express ourselves in language, we think in terms of the way we express ourselves in language, and that shapes the way that we think about things. So stewardship is that's a piece of progress, but it's not where we should stop, because beyond that, there is more complexity to be explored.
Yeah, I think, although in many senses we're both quite critical of what the first Enlightenment got wrong or overlooked, we also recognize the massive amounts of progress that it helped us achieve. I think
Absolutely, Paul. I mean, I think it's really very important. It's easy to be critical of people in the past. There's a great vogue at the moment for saying how terrible the past was and trying to rewrite history and all of this kind of thing. We need to be a bit more humble. Were we around at the time that those people were around, we probably wouldn't have been as forward thinking as many of them were. They were brilliant people who were wanting to find progress. If they took us a little bit in this way and maybe a little bit in that way might have been better, well, fine. But we must respect the extraordinary progress in thinking, in technology, in science, and so on, and in culture that they made. To say that we should go further is not necessarily a critique of what they did. It is a matter of saying that what they did took us a certain distance, and we need to review that rather than simply stay in the same place, because it no longer necessarily works out in quite the way that they had wished or planned or expected.
So yeah, I usually say that they were looking down one end of the telescope too much, and what we could do with doing is really appreciating what they discovered in the process of doing that. But at the same time, it's a good idea probably to look through both ends of the telescope to see the big picture and how everything's related, connected, and how complex everything is, so that we can start to understand better, how to manage those kinds of relationships, if indeed we can manage them, or recognize them but accept that we can't control everything. Not everything is controllable.
Absolutely.
So I think then that we can start to move forward. It's difficult for people to embrace uncertainty and complexity and all of those things, because we've been educated to believe that if we analyze everything enough, there is an answer to the problem. And we're now beginning, I think, to recognize that often there isn't an answer to a problem, and an answer may actually cause knock-on effects.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things, for example, that's becoming very clear is that as we move down the road of alternative and renewable energy, some of the kinds of rare earths that we need to make essential elements like magnets and so on, obtaining those can, at least in the present form, lead us to all sorts of other types of environmental problems and indeed human problems. So it's not simple. There's no question about that. That's why I like the term relationship, because actually all of us know that with our relationships, if we've any sense at all, we realize you never get them sorted. I often say, if you think you've got a relationship and you think it's sorted, it's already in trouble because you think it's sorted. It's something that you've got to work with all the time. We also know that we can't have a relationship with everybody. At least we can't have the same kind of relationship, and we can't necessarily have a good and positive relationship with everybody. It's much more complex than that. And we sort of know that. But then when it comes to science and technology, we think we can simplify it all down. Well, for the purposes of understanding some things, that has been helpful, but actually the truth goes much beyond that. One of the issues is the scientific methods that we use. I'm a doctor and a psychiatrist, and of course we've made great strides in things like psychopharmacology because we've been able to do double-blind crossover trials that clarify for us whether one particular medication is better and more successful than another. But in most of the really important things in life, you can't do a double-blind crossover trial. You can't do a double-blind crossover trial in your relationship with your wife or with your children. You can't do a double-blind crossover trial on the question of war. You can't say, well, let's run that war again and see if it works out the same way. And the same people, this is nonsense. So unless you're going to say science has nothing to say about some of the most important things in human life, you've got to accept that there is more than one scientific method. The method has to be appropriate to the issues you're addressing and studying, but there has to be more than one kind of scientific method. Otherwise, science is only able to deal with very, very small amount of the universal experience.
Yeah, so I remember in one interview that you gave, you said that you got into psychology in the very first place because you were trying to understand why is it people struggle to be able to live together.
Yeah.
And I also remember one quote in one of your interviews where you said it's not about finding the perfect everlasting solution to relationships. It's more about how to learn to live together without killing each other.
Well, yes, and that may sound very extreme when you're operating in the context of England, and not so extreme when you were working in the context of Northern Ireland, where people's deepest differences, religiously, culturally, and politically, did lead to people killing each other. And people often said to me after the work that we did to reach and negotiate the Good Friday Agreement, "It's wonderful that you've got this agreement." I said, "Yeah, please understand. This is, as you say, an agreement to disagree without killing each other." That's what it was. It wasn't an agreement about the future. It was an agreement that the way to deal with our differences was through argument, negotiation, and democracy. It wasn't at the point of a gun or using bombs against each other. And so that's really very important, that we are not going to agree on everything at all. This was, of course, the strength of Isaiah Berlin's philosophy of value pluralism, that there are some really fundamental differences in the way that we view things. What he was not able to do was find a way of operationalizing in politics, political structures, what value pluralism might look like. That's what we tried to do in Northern Ireland. That's what we're still trying to do there and in other parts of the world. That is a real struggle to find ways of operationalizing value pluralism. But if we don't find that, then we end up back in war again.
Yeah, I mean, so I had the experience of living in Brazil for 6 years, and in that situation, people used to find it really amusing whenever I used the phrase "agree to disagree" to take the heat out of a kind of conflicted kind of discussion. It wasn't a really serious one. It was going to lead to a war, but it was about maintaining what was potentially a valuable relationship, and the ability to agree to disagree, it seems to me like a really core skill that we seem to be losing at the moment as we see increasing levels of polarization between different political parties or factions within society. So in that kind of context, maybe what are the key lessons from your experience of dealing with that situation in the Troubles in Ireland that the rest of the world could learn from, since many other parts of the rest of the world at the moment seem to be heading in the opposite direction towards more conflict rather than away from it?
I think what happened for us was that eventually, and it was after a very, very long time indeed, some people would argue hundreds of years, we got to the point of realizing that we could keep on killing each other. Not continually, we would do it for 20 years and we'd stop for another 20 years and then we'd get back to it again. And people got to the point of saying, no, we have to find a way where we can stop this recurrent violence and find a different kind of way. So there was something about saying, we recognize this is not the way. Some of that was because people on both sides, Irish Republicans on the one hand, British government on the other hand, came to the conclusion that they couldn't actually win through the use of physical force. The IRA came to the point of realizing that they could not drive out the British government through the use of physical force. The British government would never give in to a terrorist campaign within these islands, whatever it might have done in other places. It wasn't going to do that. And the British government realized they weren't going to defeat the IRA. You know, that they could knock it down for a while, but it was a social movement. And even if you killed all the people who were involved in the IRA, you wouldn't have solved the problem, because every one of them that you killed had brothers and sisters and family and friends who would then rally to the cause. So the more violence there was, the more of a recruiting sergeant it became for each side, rather than a way of resolving the problem. So I think we came to that kind of conclusion. I don't think humanity as a whole, and in particular the leaders of the various major countries, or even smaller countries perhaps too, actually realize that this is not a way to resolve our problems at all. So that was a really important thing. I think a second thing, which I would say is important at a completely other level as well, and that is to recognize that when we are arguing and discussing and debating, the important thing is not always the content of the conversation, but the fact that we are relating with each other. You know, sometimes you may be having a conversation with somebody in your family, some of your kids perhaps, or a mother-in-law or something like that. And you listen to what they say and you think, why are they going on and on about this? Why are they I'm not interested in this. And then you realize, actually, you know, what's important is not the content of what they're talking about. I may or may not be interested in a particular video game the kids are talking about, or the particular recipe that my mother-in-law is talking about, or the particular football team that someone else is interested in. I may not be interested in that. But if I understand that the purpose of this conversation is not to educate me in this data, this content, but simply to have a relationship with me, simply to be present in each other's company, simply to engage. That's what it's about. Then I can sit and listen to it and not worry about intervening and pointing out how wrong or right they are. Not that I ignore that. If I completely ignore it, then I'm not really engaging. So I have to find a way of engaging and understanding, but not in order to tell them how wrong they are and how right I am, but how together we can explore a question and a conversation, both of us being enlightened by, but more important than that, both of us having a relationship with each other as we do it.
I guess at the heart of that, that's about recognizing that the other person is human and like me. Whereas when we see conflict going the wrong way, as it is in several places at the moment, there's usually a process of dehumanizing the other side.
You're absolutely right. And that's incredibly dangerous, because once you begin to think of the other person as less human than you are, and it starts even earlier than that with thinking that they're less to be thought of, less to be listened to. But once you think of them as less human than you, and then not really human at all, that is the road to really horrible things. It's this process of dehumanization that leads to the most awful things that happen between human beings. That's absolutely right.
So in terms of the way forward, what we should be doing is trying to find or engineer situations in which we can bring people together. Is that kind of the very first step that needs to be taken to start to reduce conflict?
I think even before the business of bringing people together, there's something about talking about the humanity of others and listening to others. At the start, sometimes it's important, before bringing two opposing sides together, to get people on one side or the other to talk amongst themselves about themselves, about their children, about their relationships, about their history, about their hopes for the future, and then about how they might find a way of living in the same island or in the same city or in the same country or in the same world as this bunch of people who have a different perspective, history, and set of expectations. So sometimes you actually have to work with one side and then another side before you even start to bring people together. But the key thing is getting people to begin to think in terms of one humanity with differences, And that's really important. Some of the people that want to think in terms of one humanity want to think we're all the same. And we're not all the same. There are some things about us that are the same, and there's some things that are different. It's living together with difference, not pretending that we're all the same, is the route towards a more harmonious world, a world characterized more by concord than discord.
In certain cultures, of course, and the West in particular, the focus on individualism was another kind of characteristic which emerged from the first Enlightenment to an extent. A lot of the real anger and animosity generally and towards each other often is related to, we hear the term identity politics quite frequently. So it's kind of, it feels like we're being attacked as individuals. How do we need to reduce the amount of sort of individualism that we tend to focus on? How do we get the balance right?
I think one of the ways is perhaps appreciating that whilst it is the case that we are to a considerable degree individuals, we're not individuals separate off and cut off from everybody else, because actually we absolutely cannot survive like that. We come into existence out of a relationship between two people, one form or another, and we cannot survive without relationships with those that care enough about us to enable us to survive from the very earliest times right through to the end of our lives. So, yes, there is a sense in which we are individuals, but there is a profound sense in which we cannot survive without relationships with others. And I do think that you're right, that the way the Enlightenment has become interpreted by some people, maybe even by many people, and the culture that seems more lately to have emerged in some parts of the world is an absurd degree of individualism. I say absurd because it really doesn't make any kind of sense to think that people can survive on their own. They can't. Physically, psychologically, socially, they can't survive on their own. We need each other. And it's finding a way of understanding how to relate with each other as individuals, in a community, as communities with other communities. That's absolutely essential. And that's quite a struggle. It's difficult enough to agree with yourself sometimes, because one part of you wants to do this and another part of you wants to do that. So even agreeing with yourself is not always easy. And it's difficult to agree with other people. But if you can identify parts of other people that you can relate with, then you can begin to develop relationships in a more fruitful kind of way. But you're absolutely right. The degree of individualism that has developed in the Western world, particularly, is a matter of great conviction for some people, including many of my liberal colleagues. But liberalism is not just about the liberty of individuals. It's also about liberality in relation with other people. It's about freedom, but it's also about generosity of spirit. And that's not just generosity to me, it's generosity in my relationship with others.
Yeah. So you use the phrase that we need to make decisions that are informed by our emotions as well as our rationality, and of course the rationality part of it relates to the first Enlightenment. It was the age of reason. That was the phrase for it. I guess the problem there is the idea of us being informed by our own emotions is something that's actually taught out of us. But we need to you're suggesting we need to appreciate, reconnect, and understand our emotions, and it's equally important as being rational, if not more important.
There's no doubt in my mind that it is enormously important. The really big decisions we make in our lives are governed much more by emotions than by anything else. Whether it's at a personal level, the relationships that we form, whether it's at a political level, the people we decide to vote for, these things are much more defined by how we feel about things than simply by what we think about things and how we think logically and rationally. And you're right. People have tended to say that the emotional side is something we should control, manage, and probably take as little account of as we can get away with. And I think that is a mistake. And I think we're beginning to become more aware of that. My colleague Dominic Johnson here at Oxford has written a book about political strategy, where he has demonstrated how sometimes those who sat down and weighed up the cost and benefit of a particular war were indeed successful. But sometimes those who refused to accept the outcome of a cost-benefit analysis, who said, I'm prepared to sacrifice, actually were the ones who ended up changing history and winning in the end. So I think we have to hold onto these two elements of things. And if one of the things that we are talking about as frightening, the development of artificial intelligence, which has the capacity to think logically far faster than a whole nation of people can think. But what artificial intelligence has not shown a capacity to do is to feel and to make decisions on the basis of feelings. So if people are sometimes getting frightened by the prospects of us being taken over by artificial intelligence, maybe they should reflect on the fact that there are qualities that we have in the context of relationships, particularly these ones of feeling and emotion that you've referred to, which artificial intelligence is a long way from getting the hold of. And if we are to appreciate ourselves and survive with all of these other competitions and rivalries, then maybe that's something not to be afraid of and not to try to set to the side, but to take account of and to value.
I mean, it seems to me that without sufficient levels of understanding of our own emotions and being, we're not particularly well equipped in order to be able to develop and maintain good relationships, because our own relationship with ourselves is not then very good. So I'm wondering whether, if we're trying to think long term and kind of solve the problems, do we need to begin first of all with dealing with our own personal inner conflicts before we can start to really appreciate how to deal with our conflicts between others and between societies?
I don't think that you can separate these things out into let's do this first and then let's do this. Let's sort myself out. Man, know thyself. Sort that out. Go into therapy or whatever, and then I will be the perfect person to engage with other people. I don't think that that's possible. I think these are all elements of it. That's why we talk about complexity rather than linearity. And in some ways, we actually have lost some of these understandings. If you go back and read literature, or look at art, listen to music from the past, you will sometimes be surprised at what they knew in those days that we have kind of forgotten about. That's why the classics are so classical. That's why I recommend that we look seriously and reflectively and respectfully at indigenous people. As I said, they have not forgotten some of the things that we have forgotten. We've discovered things they don't know, but they have not forgotten some of the things that we've forgotten about, particularly about relationships with each other as individuals and communities, and indeed with the natural world, the rest of our environment. And that's true of religious groups and religious cultures as well. They held something that was important about the human condition. They shouldn't be just dismissed as though they were of no value and we've outgrown all of that. There's something important in there.
Okay, and then just in terms of the balance that we're talking about here, what is the role of education? So, there's been in recent years a massive focus on focusing on teaching the STEM subjects, science, technology, and so on, mathematics, in education, and away from the arts and other things. And that's not just in the UK, but in many countries. And in the States, they used to teach the civics, which was about helping people become better citizens, for example. I don't recall that we've ever really had education in the civics in the UK. I certainly didn't have any of that. But I wonder what do you think the role is of education in helping us address some of this, what seems like maybe an imbalance?
Well, you say that we didn't have an education in civics in the UK. And in terms of something that was described in that form, you're right. But there were lots of other aspects that were important. Religious education, learning the classics, history, uh, people finding ways of engaging with each other on the sports field or in drama. All of these are about how we relate together, how people discovered good relationships and bad relationships in the past and in the present. All of this is civics, but it's not taught in the kind of way that it was attempted to be taught in the United States. And I'm not so sure that teaching them in the way that they were taught in the United States has necessarily enabled them to make enormous progress. Some of these things are better inculcated and absorbed than taught. I think it was one of Shakespeare's extraordinary number of contributions that he said, as the old cock crows, the young one learns. The old cock doesn't take the young one and educate it in the way that we try to educate young people. The whole notion of apprenticeship can be more important than doing a diploma course. Engaging yourself with someone and you take into yourself parts of the way of being that other person has. Of course, then it's very important to choose to whom you apprentice yourself. It was a very important choice for young people. You know, one might make the argument that actually the most important choice you make is your parents, but you tend to be a bit late to choose them. But that's really important because that determines a great deal of what happens afterwards. What you do have the opportunity to do is to choose to whom you will apprentice yourself. And that's why things like which school you go to, which university you go to, what kind of work you go into, all of these things affect and mold your life and relationships. And perhaps we need to be more aware of the differences that there are there and the importance of those choices.
But I mean, it's a fact that the levels of mental illness and growing numbers of suicide, substance abuse, and all of those things would seem to suggest that people are not very, emotionally well equipped to be able to deal with the age of angst that we're talking about at the moment. So I wonder how do you think we should, how do we resolve that problem?
I think there are many aspects to it. Many of them are things that we've been talking about in this conversation. But if I was, and it's a rather false thing to do, but if I was to identify one thing in particular, I would say it's this failure to understand the importance of relationships at a more fundamental level. There's a very superficial chitter chatter about relationships and how you make out in relationships. But actually going back to engaging with each other in a more fundamental way, in a more respectful way, in a way that values the other person, not just for what they can do for me, but for who they are in themselves and for the relationship we have and want to continue to have. That's another of the problems of present day life, is people not seeing relationships as something that they commit themselves to over a substantial period of time. In the United States, which you mentioned, I mean, one of the striking things is how fractured families are, because everything gets determined on the basis of how much money you have, and that's on the basis of what you earned. And if that means that I've got to go from the eastern seaboard to the western seaboard to get a job that pays me a little bit more money, I will do that and leave my family behind and have remarkably little contact with them. And then I wonder why I've got problems in relationships, rather than seeing a job and earning money as important, but not as the most important thing in life. Relationships are the most important thing in life. And without them, we have nothing and will be nothing.
Yeah, the fundamental driver of our sense of ourselves, our identity, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so great. We've come to the end of this interview, but can I just finish by asking you then, are there any other elements of what you regard as the necessary paradigm shift that we haven't covered in the interview, or anything that you wanted to say that I haven't asked you the right question so far?
Well, I think you've done a wonderful job of asking questions and probing and drawing certain things out from me. I don't think there's anything particular I'd want to add to it. That's not to say that I've said everything that could be said. That will never be the case. Not just because I like yourself, I enjoy conversation and talking, but because there is no end of understanding these kinds of things and of exploring them. And I'm sure that we will continue to do that, both with each other and with others. But for the moment, thank you very much indeed for the opportunity of the conversation, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to take it up with other colleagues too.
Well, we will, and quite soon. You've agreed then in a few weeks we'll have a live session with a couple of guests that will have watched this interview, and we'll have a dialogue with them, and also with a wider audience, the subscribers to the salon will be able to watch this interview, think through what questions they might have, and be able to join the questions and answers session in the couple of hours that we have live online in, I think it's about 3 weeks' time. So look forward to that very much indeed. And I thank you very much for your time today.
Not at all, and I look forward to it as well, Paul. All the very
Thank
best.
you. Cheers. Thanks a lot.